The air over Gaul in the spring of 451 carried a tension unlike any other in living memory. The hills and forests of the region, usually tranquil, were now under the shadow of a storm, the impending march of forces that would determine the fate of an entire kingdom. The Western Roman Empire, already fraying at the edges, faced a threat both immediate and existential. From the east, the Huns, masters of mounted terror, had begun a campaign that promised to sweep aside kingdoms and reshape the continent. For 2 generations, Rome had been losing its grip. Its legions were stretched thin, its coffers depleted, and its administrative structure increasingly incapable of defending borders that had once been secure. Yet, in Gaul, there remained a semblance of order anchored by the Visigoths and by local Roman forces. Even here, however, stability was fragile. Tribal migrations, internal revolts, and the rising power of new warlords had left every city and village on edge. And now, the figure would come to symbolize the storm itself. Attila moved with inexorable momentum, gathering tribes and mercenaries into a force that seemed unstoppable. Attila's reputation had grown through deeds of terror and meticulous organization. In the eyes of those who had seen him, he was less a man than a force of nature, a strategist whose understanding of mounted warfare, psychological intimidation, and logistical precision made him the most formidable opponent of his era. His path westward was not aimless raiding. It was a campaign meticulously orchestrated to coerce kingdoms into submission, to strip Gaul of its resources, and to test the very limits of Roman and barbarian resistance. In the Roman provinces, the response was cautious and fragmented. Flavius Aetius, the Magister Militum, bore the weight of defending the realm almost alone. He was a man shaped by the world he inherited. Schooled among the Huns themselves as a hostage, trained in Roman strategy, versed in diplomacy, and tempered by years of navigating the treacherous politics of both the court and the battlefield. His knowledge of the Huns' methods was perhaps the empire's best chance of survival, yet it was a narrow foundation. Aetius could not summon unlimited legions. He could not replenish supplies at will. He could only maneuver, negotiate, and marshal every available force. The Visigothic king, Theodoric I, understood this danger intimately. His realm in southwestern Gaul had prospered under a careful balance of Roman alliance and autonomous rule. Yet he could not ignore Attila's advance. Both leaders faced the same dilemma: to strike preemptively with a force that was, in many ways, insufficient, or to await reinforcements and risk giving Attila unchallenged access to vital territories. The calculus of war was not only measured in numbers, but in timing, terrain, and the intangible courage, or desperation, of men. As spring waned, Aetius began coordinating his forces across the fragmented landscape of Gaul. Local levies, remnants of Roman legions, and allied barbarian contingents were gathered in a tense mosaic of readiness. Communication was a challenge. Messages traveled slowly, and each messenger risked interception by scouts and raiders. Yet, despite these obstacles, a coherent plan began to emerge. To unite with Theodoric's Visigoths, to confront Attila where the land allowed for some tactical advantage, and to exploit the Huns' overconfidence in their mobility. The terrain itself became a central character in this unfolding drama. Gaul's river valleys, dense forests, and rolling hills were both a blessing and a threat. They offered opportunities for concealment, ambush, and maneuver, yet they also limited the ability of heavy cavalry and infantry to deploy effectively. Aetius understood that he could not meet Attila in open plains without grave risk. The Huns' horse archers would turn a frontal engagement into slaughter. The selection of the battlefield, therefore, was not merely a matter of geography. It was a calculation of survival, a way to bend circumstance toward strategy. In the weeks before the confrontation, both sides engaged in maneuvers that would foreshadow the coming catastrophe. Attila, never one to rely solely on brute force, probed defenses, sending detachments to test the resolve of local garrisons. Roman and Visigothic scouts returned with fragmented reports. Villages burned, small bands of Huns advancing, and most unnerving, the speed with which these mounted warriors struck and vanished. Each report intensified the pressure on Aetius and Theodoric, forcing them to consider whether delay would strengthen their position or merely invite devastation. Amid this tension, political calculations weighed heavily. Theodoric could not commit his Visigoths without the assurance that Roman forces would hold their own. Aetius, in turn, depended on Visigothic cavalry to bolster his numbers and provide the shock needed to confront the Huns. There was no room for error. Mistrust could unravel coordination, while premature engagement risked annihilation. Every council of war was marked by caution, every march calculated to preserve the fragile coalition. As the armies moved closer to the region of the Catalonian plains, an area of open land interspersed with woods, streams, and marshes, the psychological pressure on commanders mounted. Roman soldiers, many of them veterans of previous campaigns, felt the familiar tension of facing a foe renowned for speed and savagery. The Visigoths, proud and fierce, understood the stakes. The survival of their kingdom rested on their ability to hold the line against an enemy that had toppled cities across the continent. And the Huns, disciplined and merciless, operated with the certainty of dominance, seeking to exploit hesitation and to shatter resistance with rapid, devastating strikes. Within this maelstrom of anticipation, one could sense the fragile balance of history. A single misjudgment, a river miscrossed, a flank left exposed, a cavalry charge poorly timed, could tip the scales irreversibly. Aetius, aware of the stakes, pressed his men to maintain discipline, to hold formations, and to resist the instinct to panic in the face of mounted archers who could strike from impossible distances. He understood that psychological resilience would be as critical as physical might. Meanwhile, Attila's preparations reflected the same strategic sophistication. Intelligence was gathered from scouts, deserters, and informants. Supply lines were tightened, and the Hunnic forces were arrayed in a flexible, mobile configuration that could respond to Roman maneuvers. But even within this apparent confidence, Attila faced limits. He relied on terror as a force multiplier, but extended campaigns in hostile territory required careful management of provisions, horses, and tribal contingents whose loyalty was not absolute. Every step forward carried both opportunity and risk. As the days passed, the convergence of these armies created a tension that seemed almost tangible. From the vantage of hilltops, one could imagine the lines of riders, infantry, and banners slowly approaching, each side aware that the coming clash would not merely determine victory or defeat, but the survival of kingdoms. For men at the front, there was no grand theory of history, only the immediate pressures of orders, terrain, and the men to their left and right. Fear, courage, and anticipation intertwined in every heartbeat. And then, finally, as June approached, both forces drew within sight of one another. The Catalonian plains offered a stage for confrontation. Here, the decision of where to fight, how to array forces, and when to commit would shape not only the battle itself, but the political landscape of Western Europe for decades to come. In this world, where empires teetered in the shadow of annihilation loomed, commanders were forced to reconcile ambition with pragmatism, loyalty with survival, and hope with the inevitability of loss. The stage was set, not with fanfare, but with the quiet, suffocating knowledge that the clash to come would test the limits of leadership, courage, and strategy. History, poised at the edge of blade, was about to be written in blood. The first movements of cavalry, the precise placement of infantry, the subtle decisions to fortify high ground or conceal reserves, these were the threads that would weave the narrative of the battle. And as the armies prepared, a deeper understanding emerged. This would not be a mere skirmish or raid. It was a collision of worlds, a confrontation between two visions of power and survival, and the outcome would echo far beyond the fields of Gaul. It was here in the tension before contact that the hopes of a kingdom and the fears of an empire hung suspended. Every decision mattered. Every hesitation could be fatal. And every soldier, whether Roman, Visigoth, or Hun, would play a role in a drama that would determine the shape of Europe for generations to come. The dawn over the Catalonian plains was muted, as if the world itself held its breath. Mist clung to the low hills and river valleys, drifting across the open fields where thousands of men and horses would soon converge. From this vantage, one could begin to understand the intricate, almost fragile geometry of the battlefield. Unlike the broad, rolling plains of steppe, Gaul presented a patchwork of rivers, marshes, and wooded ridges. These natural features dictated strategy, forcing commanders to shape their formations not merely around numbers, but around the land itself. On the western edge of the field, the Roman and Visigothic forces began to consolidate. Aetius had drawn together what remained of the imperial legions, augmented by Frankish and Burgundian contingents, and supplemented with local militia hastily trained and poorly equipped. Discipline varied widely. Veterans moved with quiet precision, their eyes scanning for the subtle cues of movement and signal. Younger recruits shifted nervously, their grips on spears and shield betraying the tension coiled within them. Behind the infantry, heavy cavalry formed the backbone of the force, a wedge of armored riders whose presence would be critical in absorbing or delivering shock. King Theodoric marshaled his Visigothic warriors with the same meticulous care. These men were professional soldiers, accustomed to mounted warfare and to the ferocity of frontal combat. Their axes and spears glinted in the sparse sunlight, and banners marked the divisions of their tribal units. Though allied with Rome, the Visigoths retained their independent command structure, a factor that demanded constant communication and careful orchestration. Any misalignment between Roman and Gothic contingents could prove fatal, especially against an enemy as mobile and unpredictable as the Huns. From the eastern side, Attila's army spread across the terrain like a living, breathing organism. The Huns were no mere mass of riders. Their force was a carefully composed combination of light cavalry, horse archers, and mounted shock troops, each unit capable of operating independently or in coordinated maneuvers. Scouts and skirmishers probed the flanks, reporting on river crossings, marshy ground, and the disposition of enemy forces. The psychological pressure they exerted was deliberate. Sudden movements, scattered raids, and distant volleys of arrows kept the Roman and Visigothic lines tense, constantly anticipating the next strike. The composition of Attila's army emphasized mobility and adaptability. Horse archers could rain arrows with devastating speed, retreating almost as soon as they fired to avoid counterattack. Heavy mounted units could strike into weakened flanks, while allied contingent from Gothic and other Germanic tribes added numerical support. Coordination was key. The Huns relied on a combination of shock, feigned retreats, and encirclement tactics honed over decades of steppe warfare. Every rider understood his role. Every horse was conditioned for endurance, and every arrow release carried both physical and psychological weight. As morning unfolded, the first tension points became visible. River banks, low ridges, and wooded copses were occupied with small detachments meant to delay or disrupt enemy reconnaissance. Roman engineers hastily constructed makeshift obstacles, while the Visigoths scouted potential gaps. Attila, recognizing these attempts, adapted his strategy. Probing attacks tested weak points, while feigned withdrawals lured the Allied forces into positions where the Huns' mobility could be exploited. Both sides were acutely aware that the first skirmishes would set the tone for the entire engagement. When the initial clash occurred, it was neither overwhelming nor dramatic, yet revealed the underlying discipline of each force. Hunnic horse archers struck at forward Roman positions, keeping infantry in motion and forcing adjustments in formation. Aetius, understanding the danger of overextension, ordered incremental retreats and repositioning, maintaining cohesion while avoiding panic. Theodoric's cavalry countered selectively, engaging Hunnic detachments with disciplined charges designed to blunt mobility rather than chase. These early encounters were a delicate interplay of action and reaction, a chess game enacted with thousands of men and horses under conditions of mortal risk. The battlefield itself amplified confusion. Streams bisected fields, limiting the maneuver of heavy cavalry and forcing units into narrow lanes. Marshy ground slowed infantry, leaving them vulnerable to mounted archers who could strike from a distance, which provided cover but limited visibility, creating uncertainty about enemy positions. In this environment, command and control were tested to their limits. Signal flags, horn blasts, and runners became lifelines, transmitting orders across the sprawling field where a single misinterpreted command could unravel hours of preparation. By mid-morning, the Huns began to consolidate pressure on specific points along the Allied line. Small but relentless cavalry thrusts sought to find a weakness, to bend the formation into disorder. Psychological strain became as tangible as physical exertion. Soldiers grew tense, scanning for sudden movements, reacting to the invisible threat of arrows. Horses, conditioned for shock and speed, sensed the anxiety of their riders, amplifying every sudden noise or movement. The cohesion of Roman and Visigothic units faced an unprecedented test. Aetius and Theodoric had anticipated this. They had prepared reserves to plug gaps, redeploy archers, and reinforce threatened sectors. Yet each commitment carried risk. Drawing units from one sector could weaken another, and committing cavalry prematurely could expose them to flanking maneuvers. The psychological toll on commanders was immense. Every glance across the field involved calculation and foresight. How to anticipate Attila's next move, how to manage fatigue, how to sustain morale when the Huns struck with both speed and unpredictability. The first real attempt at mass engagement occurred along a ridge overlooking a shallow river. The Huns, testing Roman fortitude, advanced in a coordinated wave, their horse archers peppering the defenders with arrows. Roman shields formed a wall. Visigothic axes raised a strike when the riders closed. The clash was sudden, violent, yet controlled, an exercise in discipline against terror. Infantry held, absorbing volleys and resisting the instinct to flee. Cavalry units maneuvered to counter flanking attempts, exploiting gaps that Hunnic scouts inadvertently exposed. Despite these early successes, the strain of facing a highly mobile enemy became evident. Units that held firm for minutes showed signs of weariness. Horses were sweating, riders tense, and minor mistakes multiplied under pressure. Attila's forces, recognizing both opportunity and limits, executed a classic feigned retreat on the northern flank. A small contingent withdrew under controlled pressure, drawing Visigothic cavalry into uneven terrain. The moment was brief but instructive. Huns were masters not only of attack, but of manipulation, exploiting human impulses and battlefield psychology with precision. Aetius responded swiftly. He recalled pursuing units, re-establishing the integrity of the line, and adjusted infantry to cover exposed areas. Communication became critical. Signal runners darted across the field, relaying orders that determined whether units would hold, advance, or reinforce. The sense of immediacy was absolute. Hesitation could mean encirclement, misinterpretation could mean collapse. Commanders operated under a relentless feedback loop, observing the enemy, reading their own troops, and anticipating both in real time. Meanwhile, the Huns applied pressure elsewhere, probing the center with small formations designed to lure allies into overextension. Horse archers fired volleys, then retreated, drawing infantry forward into muddy approaches and uneven ground. Roman and Visigothic reserves plugged gaps, but the effort was exhausting. Soldiers, forced to advance and withdraw repeatedly, felt the cumulative weight of anticipation, exertion, and fear. Leadership became less about issuing orders and more about maintaining cohesion under strain, ensuring that units did not fracture under both physical and psychological pressure. By late morning, it was clear that the battle would not be a single decisive engagement, but a grinding, multi-front confrontation. The Allied forces had weathered initial attacks, demonstrating discipline and cohesion, yet the Huns' mobility and tactical ingenuity imposed a constant, corrosive strain. Every skirmish, every arrow volley, every maneuver contributed to the mental calculus of men who understood the stakes. One breach could cascade into catastrophe. One moment of hesitation could be fatal. The field itself, shaped by nature and by the flow of engagement, created opportunities for both sides. Ridges offered observation posts and defensive advantage. Rivers constrained movement but could funnel the enemy, which provided cover but concealed danger. Every decision, where to place infantry, when to commit cavalry, how to position reserves, was amplified by the environment, and misjudgment could negate numerical or qualitative advantage. In this intricate interplay, strategy and terrain were inseparable. As noon approached, the battle began to coalesce into its larger, defining phases. Hunnic attacks increased in intensity, exploiting both psychological strain and the natural features of the field. Roman and Visigothic forces, though disciplined, faced mounting pressure on multiple fronts. Commanders acted as much through intuition and experience as through orders, adjusting the threats as they emerged, balancing aggression and caution. It was a battle of nerves and calculation, as much as strength and numbers. Every arrow, every charge, every repositioning was part of a complex dialogue between forces, each probing the other, each seeking a critical weakness. Soldiers, officers, and commanders alike were engaged in a struggle that extended beyond mere survival. It was an exercise in anticipation, endurance, and the careful application of force under conditions of extreme uncertainty. The stage had been set, and the forces had taken their initial positions. What had begun as cautious probing now transformed into sustained engagement, the first signs of the pivotal clash that would determine not only the outcome of this battle, but the survival of kingdoms across Gaul. The momentum of the day hung in balance, and the actions of every unit would ripple across the field, shaping the turning points to come. By mid-afternoon, the Catalonian plains were transformed into a crucible of tension and attrition. Dust rose from the movements of thousands of horses. The metallic ring of armor echoed through the valleys, and the air was thick with the scent of exertion, sweat, and the faint, acrid tang of blood. What had begun as cautious probing had escalated into a series of violent engagements across multiple fronts. The battle had entered its decisive phase, where discipline, endurance, and the acute judgment of commanders would determine the fate of kingdoms. Attila, ever perceptive, recognized both the promise and danger of the day. His forces had achieved localized successes, pushing Roman and Visigothic units into temporary disorder and exploiting terrain where mobility gave him advantage. Yet the Allied lines had held in crucial sectors, absorbing initial attacks with remarkable cohesion. The psychological calculus now became critical. Continued pressure might fracture enemy formations, but overextension risked a counterattack from reserves that had remained largely uncommitted. The turning point began with a calculated Hunnic assault against the northern sector, where the terrain offered both constraint and opportunity. Feigning retreat, a small contingent drew Visigothic cavalry forward into marshy ground. For a moment, the Gothic riders seemed ensnared, their progress slowed, their cohesion threatened. It was precisely the scenario Attila had sought, an attempt to unbalance a disciplined opponent through subtle manipulation of terrain and psychology. Yet Aetius had anticipated such tactics. From his vantage near the center, he observed the movement and issued rapid counterorders, directing infantry reserves to reinforce the threatened flank and signaling cavalry units to circle and contain any overextension. The coordination, delicate under ideal circumstances, was now executed under extreme stress, with runners dodging between units, horns signaling repositioning, and commanders adjusting formations in real time. The countermeasure succeeded, but at a cost. The Huns had drawn significant Visigothic strength into exposed terrain, forcing rapid redeployments that taxed both men and horses. Fatigue began to accumulate, and the strain of prolonged vigilance was evident on faces streaked with sweat and grime. Soldiers, trained for short bursts of action, now operated under the cumulative pressure of hours of high-intensity engagement. Even minor errors, a miscommand, a delayed reposition, carried immediate, potentially lethal consequences. It was in this crucible that the Allied forces executed a decisive maneuver. Aetius, recognizing that sustained Hunnic pressure relied on isolated shocks rather than mass frontal assault, ordered a concentrated push along the center. Roman infantry advanced steadily, maintaining formation while archers and skirmishers suppressed Hunnic riders. Theodoric's Visigothic cavalry executed a synchronized charge, striking the Huns' flanks and disrupting their coordination. The moment of impact was precise and brutal. Mobile units collided with force they could not fully anticipate, and the Huns' disciplined organization, dependent on speed and flexibility, faced a sudden, cohesive counter. The effect on the battlefield was immediate. Hunnic units, accustomed to dictating the tempo, now faced pressure from multiple directions. Horse archers attempted to withdraw under fire, but the sudden surge of Allied cavalry limited their escape, creating localized confusion. Infantry, long engaged in defensive holding, pressed forward into gaps created by the disruption. Attila himself, though commanding from a position that allowed oversight, was forced to adapt as the rhythm of battle shifted unpredictably. The moment highlighted the fragile equilibrium of tactical dominance. Even a force renowned for mobility and terror could be unbalanced when confronted with well-timed, coordinated resistance.